Welcome, friends. James Corbett here, CorbettReport.com. It is that time of the month, which is, of course, the time of the month in which we invite our good friend David L. Smith of the Geneva Business Insider back on the program to talk about things that are unfolding in Europe and around the world, economically, socially, geopolitically, and otherwise. If you haven't yet done so, please do check out the Geneva Business Insider blog, as infrequently as updated as it may be. And, of course, that will be linked in the show notes for this program. As always, David Smith, always a great pleasure to talk to you. Thanks for joining us.
Good to be here again, and I've had some nice feedback over the last month on my reappearance, which is very flattering, and I hope to continue.
The crowd clamors for more, so let's supply them with that. And there's a lot to talk about, but I think something in your neck of the woods that's of great interest, although it does not directly affect Switzerland, but still there has been some Swiss reaction to what's happened recently. And of course, I'm talking about the European parliamentary vote that just took place and has been called a tidal change or a political earthquake, or it's been described in different ways. But long story short, the Eurosceptics of various stripes have doubled their representation in European Parliament and become a significant minority that will potentially have the ability to create a bit of havoc and chaos within the European parliamentary system, which may be a good thing. But let's get your take on what just transpired there in the EU vote.
Yeah, well, it's a very, very interesting situation. I mean, there has been for a long time now clamors from people who want to see less control from Europe, and we have seen a lot of mouthing from the politicians of saying yes, 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 and in the UK, David Cameron promising a vote, but of course once he gets re-elected and with enough preconditions that makes you think it may never happen. The public are just generally getting fed up. There's an overwhelming frustration with the austerity measures, which are designed, as we well know, to make the banks rich and safe, and the workers poor and vulnerable. And people are finally beginning to wake up and kind of make protests to it. Now, lots of people talk about this as being an earthquake. I would say it is the beginning of a phase of turning. It's maybe the El Alamein of the situation, but it's certainly not yet in Hitler's bunker. So, but if you look, I will take the UK for example, which is maybe the best case with Nigel Farage's UKIP party. It's been pooh-hooed for years, ridiculed and ignored, and now it can neither be ridiculed nor ignored. And Nigel Farage, I mean, I've met him a couple of times, and I actually like the guy. You know, he's a good guy to have a beer with, a cigarette with. And by the way, Nigel, if you're listening, you still owe me a beer. So, you kind of look at his success, and now he is actually destabilizing the main parties. And you look at what is happening in Brussels, where, of course, the left and the centre-right parties still have a huge amount of votes compared to the others. However, they're looking a bit at like having to form a grand coalition to eliminate the others. In which case, you're beginning to say what is the point in the 80% excluding the thoughts of the 20%. Or they end up in bed with parties like UKIP, which I think is inconceivable. Now, I think where there is a problem is if you look at the anti-European Union parties as a whole, or the nationalist parties, whatever you want to call it, some of them are widely different in the way they look at things. I mean, Marine Le Pen in France, who is, I think, if I remember correctly, got 24% of the poll, compared to the incumbent president's party, which got 14%, and the previous Sarkozy's party, which got about 12 or 13. You're looking at someone who basically represents a resentment vote, because at the end of the day, the French are not fundamentally racist, nationalist to the extent that Marine Le Pen is. But what is showing is there's a ground movement against all of the establishment politics gains in Europe. Same thing in Holland to a lesser degree. But you have all these people who are voting for these, let's say, off the main track two-party system in order to try and get the voice heard, because they know that with the the oligarch-controlled, bank-controlled main parties, that they're going to get nowhere. And little by little, this will happen. And it doesn't take much imagination to turn the clock back to the 1930s, where everyone was laughing at Hitler with 3 or 4% of the poll. And within 10 years, he was chancellor. And God knows what, we all know what happened after that. And God forbid that Europe ever go down a route like that. But the surest way to go down that kind of route is to continue to ignore the will of the people. And eventually, all of these, the EU's sole and unique purpose is to ignore the will of the people, and in order to pursue their unaccountable agendas to satisfy their true masters. So this can end badly.
Let's examine that a little, because that's an interesting point that you just raised. The idea that it's the populist tendency which is in counterbalance or counteracting the sort of the haughty elite who feel they can ignore the masses is where these movements come from. And as you point out, that was the sort of socio-political context that made the rise of the Nazis in the 1930s possible, because of that sort of disconnect between what was happening economically and politically versus what the people were feeling and experiencing. And that obviously plays into an authoritarian mindset, which is obviously what played out with the Nazis and the rise of Hitler. But now we are in a similar situation where we have this. I think of it, I mean, there are certainly political ramifications to what UKIP and the National Front and these types of organizations argue, but I think that this has to be seen more as a sociological phenomenon, what we just saw. And I think along the lines of what you are talking about, the reconnecting of politics to the sort of the populism. It's a re-rise of some sort of populist politics, which has its own pitfalls, potentially. So we are on a cusp of a very interesting moment. And my question to you is, why now? There's nothing fundamentally different, I would say, from the position that has existed for certainly at least 1 or 2 election cycles, if not much longer. Why are people suddenly connecting with some of these formerly fringe groups?
Well, I think the answer there is very simple. I mean, it is the austerity environment that's being created, and the fact that people are feeling genuine hardship. And, the elites have no concern whatsoever about the average person. In fact, they don't even understand remotely what the life of an average person is like. I mean, you take our British politicians, who are from mainly from the very privileged elite families in the first place. They've never lived in a council house. They've never bought a pint of milk, as Ed Miliband was embarrassed into showing that he hadn't a clue how much a pint of milk cost. Now, I mean, these are things that when someone says, when all of the realities that you're living with are totally unknown to the person who's saying, I'm with you, I'm behind you, I understand you, and your situation every day is getting worse, and, the guy at the bottom of the pile, he's watching his food bill go up every month or his beer bill go up every month. There'll be less and less money available for himself or his holidays or whatever, and observing where money is being thrown away. I mean, like we talked last time about the Ukraine and giving many billions of dollars to the Ukraine from the EU without any consultation whatsoever. And that obviously touches people in countries like Greece very heavily. And we see there again, there's a tremendous rise in the anti-European Syriza party, and there's also a big rise in the extreme right parties, which is again deeply disturbing. But what we have created at the moment is a kind of fascism light environment where coercion is done in a gentle way rather than in the brutal way of the 1930s. But when order starts to break down, which inevitably it will, if people just keep getting their frustration levels up, then things are going to get tougher and tougher and tougher. And wherever you go around the world, you see in China, for example, the violent repression that is being used there on protesters. When states ultimately their sole purpose is to perpetuate themselves, and if killing or beating up the citizenry is the means to the end to do that, then none of them have any problems doing it whatsoever, whether they do it with a smile or with a snarl.
I think that's really the point. I mean, there are many different ways to look at this, but it's really the question of centralization of power and control in few hands as represented by the European Union, or the decentralization of that power and control. And I guess the question is, what is the best strategy for doing that? Just on a side note, you note Greece and some of the other countries that might be resentful of European Union money being sent off to Ukraine and what have you. But don't worry, the Eurozone crisis is now solved. The EU new regulations will require countries to include drugs, prostitution, and other illegal revenue sources as part of their GDP calculations. So countries like Italy is now expecting a 2% GDP growth this year on the back of that recalculation they're going to have to do. So I guess the EU problems are solved economically speaking, but that's just
I guess that Berlusconi will account personally for at least 1%.
Yes, the Bunga Bunga parties. Yeah. Personally fueling the Italian economy. Well, I guess the other question to ask with regards to this recent vote is, what does the EU Parliament do? What does this actually affect? How will this actually have an effect on what the European Union actually does?
Well, I think, like with most people in these situations, they will continue to ignore it as far as possible because, as I say, if they manage to form a grand coalition of the two major parties, then things will go on as before. And for these fragmented parties, they need to get representations from people of like-minded parties from at least 7 countries in Europe who have got like-minded agendas, and they need, I forget how many votes that you need in order to have to create a little grouping which has more influence. But some of these people are very divided. I mean, I don't think Nigel Farage, for example, would get into bed with some of the more extreme right-wing parties, even although that would be an easy way to pick up some additional points and have influence. But I think the central parties are going to be the same. They're going to have to compromise in the grand coalition. So it is eating away at them little by little, making things a bit more difficult. But they will continue to ignore it, as elites always continue to ignore reality until it comes to an end. And maybe it's unfair to say elites. I mean, it is human nature to think that things can go on when there are obvious indications that the best thing to do is go down a different course. And we have evidence of that in the financial world with QE, and we think that's going to be the answer. And the answer with central banks who think that they can micromanage the entire world's economy between about 20 people. All of these things, obviously, ultimately are going to fall apart.
It's a very good point, and one to keep in mind. Sometimes the failings and foibles of our own psychology we should understand also apply to these so-called would-be elite who are not different classes of people from us fundamentally. Well, except for psychopathy or other latent psychological problems that might infest their ranks. Well, let's turn to a related topic that is interesting to watch as another example of this decentralization phenomenon that I think is represented in the rise of the EU skeptic in EU Parliament. And I'm talking about the Scottish independence referendum that's going to be taking place later this year. And this is not a subject that I believe I've covered in much detail or even any detail so far yet. So why don't you set the groundwork for us and tell us just a little bit about where this referendum is coming from, how it came to be, and what is it we're looking at if this actually does go ahead?
Boy, that's a big question. I mean, first of all,
in 3 sentences or less, please.
First, I'd better declare my conflicts of interest because I am half English and half Scottish, so I'm already a potential dual national, or with my Swiss passport, a triple national. But I was brought up until I was in my early 20s in Scotland, and I lived in different parts of it. I lived in the far north, which is fishing and agriculture and a little bit of shooting and holidays and things like that. I lived in Aberdeen, which became the major centre for the oil industry, basically grafted onto a fishing and agricultural environment as well. Then in Glasgow, which is more in industrial, shipbuilding, coal mining, and so on. And then Edinburgh, the capital. And taking all of that together, I had a good look at it when I finished my exams. And the first thing I did was I took a plane and I went to London. So, I mean, I guess you would count me as an economically, internally displaced person because, Scotland has relatively limited economic possibilities, or certainly at that time. And this is changing now quite a bit, but it's still insular. Its economy is still quite limited, and there is a great deal of emotional appeal to Scottish nationalism, which is basically another word for socialism. I mean, it is cannibalized the Socialist Party into a rear place in Scottish politics, but by voicing the same approximate agenda and adding to it the emotional appeal of Scotland the Brave, and if I look at it, the elections which are coming up shortly, I, for example, am not allowed to vote in those elections, because I am not living within Scotland, even although I may have investments there, pay taxes there, etc., etc. However, if you're a 16-year-old schoolboy, you can get the vote, because again, the younger and the less educated people are, the more they're likely to follow the sentimental nationalistic line. So how Alex Salmond, who's the leader of the Scottish Nationalist Party, managed to get that one over on the British government, I don't know. Then you have the question of what is actually going to happen to Scotland if it is fortunate or unfortunate enough to become independent. Now, again, if I speak with my English friends, they said if they give us the vote, we'd all vote that Scotland leaves. So you have a contradiction there. But there are major issues, and I can't detail them all, but what do you do with the oil industry, where a lot of the oil is off Scottish waters? How do you deal with the most bankrupt financial institution in the UK, which is the Royal Bank of Scotland, which is affectionately called at the moment the Royal Bank of England for obvious reasons? What do you do with the military facilities which are in the country, most particularly, the early warning system, Air Force positions, and the nuclear submarine bases, which are on the west coast of Scotland? And the other thing, which I think is very telling, is that if Scotland does get its independence, you're going to have a country which is profoundly socialist, with a neighbour which would become, by the exclusion of the Scottish MPs, perpetually conservative. So then the last kind of phase of it, which I find comical, it is that while they want to leave, they want to stay at the same time. So they want to keep the English pound, which means they will be perpetually in the grips of the financial policies dictated by the Bank of England. They want to keep the present monarch, an awful lot of the status quo things. So at the end of the day, if you look at a country which claims independence and then gives sovereignty over the money supply to another country whose political agenda is completely opposed to theirs, how on earth can it work? And then I suppose the last thing I'd talk about is, personal interests, because Mr. Alex Salmond he's a very personable guy. In fact, for those who were brought up before the times of Harry Potter, there were school books that we read, things like The Wind in the Willows, and there's a character in there called Mr. Toad of Toad Hall, who is actually a caricature of Alex Salmond. He's reasonably smart, he's quite articulate, he's very egocentric. He goes around wearing Harris tweed jackets, he's significantly overweight, and he does have the same kind of beaming smile as Toad of Toad Hall. But at the end of the day, what is this guy going to bring? I mean, apart from his own aggrandizement, which was the objective of Mr. Toad of Toad Hall, I just really don't see that they have a true vision of what could be an independent Scotland.
Well, now, that's the point, isn't it? I mean, this is so important and fundamental to what is actually being decided on. And as far as I understand, the actual question that will be answered, yes or no, is should Scotland be an independent country? That leads to all sorts of questions about what that actually means. And I come at this from the Canadian perspective, having lived through the Quebec referendum, where there was no clear sense of what it actually meant if they did actually vote for separation. There was talk of sovereignty association and using the Canadian dollar and the Canadian passport and all of this. And it was not clear what it actually meant for Quebec to separate. And in this case, I'm not sure, is there an articulate vision of exactly what type of relationship Scotland would seek with the UK?
No, I don't think it is fully defined, and I think Salmon's agenda is not to have a vision, but to accumulate votes. So he's going to say whatever is necessary to get the votes. As I say, for in large measure for his own aggrandizement. I would subscribe if I had the vote. I mean, I would certainly subscribe to voting for Scottish independence, but they would have to do a few radical things like have their, completely separate themselves from the pound sterling, have their own currency, decide what they do about the military, perhaps do the same thing as the Ukraine did with Russia and just rent the bases. But at the moment, you get people like Lord Robertson, who was a former head of NATO, with his doom and gloom projections that, the whole world will fall apart if Scotland isn't part of the UK because of the military risks from our enemies. Well, I mean, the whole thing is complete bloody nonsense, but you listen to these propagandistic nonsense, and at least from my point of view, it just turns me off completely because I know what's behind it. But, this appeals to the lower educated, emotional Scottish vote. And never forget in Scotland, I took my own illustration of, getting on the plane and leaving to England. The best talents in Scotland leave and they do go to England. So you do have a country which is to some degree decapitated of their finer minds and finer skills, who are to be found having brilliant careers in, large multinationals like in the oil sector, Shell or BP, or going to Hong Kong and being successful there, going to London, etc. And then you have this kind of, somewhat second tier country with second tier people trying to, make decisions as to how they should go forward. I mean, I just find I find the whole thing rather sad.
It is, isn't it? It is somewhat disheartening because, again, decentralization, I think, is a good thing. But again, the devil is in the details. And it's just like the EU skeptics. It's a question of how we decentralize the system, where that's the real question at stake. And it doesn't seem there's a lot of answers here.
Yeah.
Oh, well, all right. Well, I think we will leave that issue to the side for now, but of course we'll return to it as we draw closer to the actual referendum date. But let's turn to a different subject altogether, but one that we've kind of been covering repeatedly during our conversations, but continues to be important and in the news, and more so. And this is something, a phenomenon that's been identified on Zero Hedge and other such blogs as the mainstreaming of the conspiracy theory that gold price is manipulated. And we have indications of this coming out on a regular basis these days. And in fact, recently there was a German television program on a news network that did a report on this. And there was the latest piece of news that went across the headlines. A regulator fines Barclays over the pricing of gold, which, taking this from DealBook, quote, a British financial regulator has fined Barclays $43.9 million after accusing a former trader at the bank of improperly influencing gold prices at the expense of a customer. And this goes back to Mr. Plunkett, who was a day trader at Barclays and who apparently was involved in the LIBOR manipulation and also in gold price manipulation. And so this looks to me, at least from the outside, I haven't studied this in great detail, but it looks to me like another example of that phenomenon whereby when the dam starts to break on a certain piece of information, throw a couple of underlings under the bus and pretend that was where the problem really lay. I'm not sure that's exactly what is happening in this case, but at any rate, the idea of gold price manipulation is more and more in the news these days. Any thoughts, insights into this phenomenon?
Yeah, sure. I mean, you're exactly right. I mean, the Barclays thing is little more than a joke. It's just thrown out for the public to think, oh, well, the problem's solved. It's got nothing at all to do with that. I mean, if you look at today, the last 24 hours where its options expiry, where gold contracts are settled approximately at the end of a month, gold was down yesterday 1.5%. And again, this is pure manipulation by the people who are sitting on potential losses. If the gold price were left where it should be, so they manipulate and drive the market down. If you look above the level of this poor simple little trader who's an irrelevant fly in the ointment, nothing more. I mean, the gold price fixing committee is based in London. They have representatives from about half a dozen banks. And if you look at the members of that committee, they're now fleeing the sinking ship as fast as possible. And I think even the head of the Barclays member of that committee has left. And its credibility obviously is getting more and more doubtful. But whenever there's anything really nasty happens, there's a quick establishment phone call saying, well, you should retire and we'll find a nice job for you somewhere else, or you'll get a decent payoff, and thanks for all the good work that you've done and the billions you've ripped off from the general public. You've served their interests perfectly. And it's nothing more or less than that. So, gold, at the moment people are trying to see physical gold. Austria is trying to see their physical gold. I just wonder if they'll check the serial numbers or whether it'll be shown the same pile of gold that was shown a few weeks ago to Germany, when they said, everything's okay. The whole area, I believe is a great big crime scene. And behind the trivial little people who are playing this game, the real players in the game of massive global manipulation of gold are the bullion banks, who very normally are acting under the presumed instructions of the Bank of International Settlements and the Federal Reserve and the Bank of England. And where does a regulator have anything to say about that? He's just going, as he's a paid lackey of these people in the first place. And he's looking forward to coming back to getting a hugely overpaid job after he's finished keeping the cover on the lie for another few years. There is no way that there is any chance of gold manipulation stopping until they run out of the physical gold to actually deliver on the contracts and when people ask for delivery. And I think that war is beginning to heat up. Making enemies of Russia and China may well lead to an acceleration of disappearance of physical gold and put these people who've been lying for years in a very difficult spot.
In fact, we can point to the phenomenon in March, I believe. Russia dumped the largest amount of U.S. treasuries it has in any single month, and I believe the next month, in April, they purchased a considerable, I believe, 910,000 troy ounces of gold to add to their reserves. So we can see that phenomenon taking place. And just to add and back up some of the things you were talking about there, for those who don't know, there's this story. First Germany, now Austria, demands an audit of its offshore held gold. So that contributes to this snowballing process that we see taking place. And yes, you're right. You mentioned the London Gold Fix, which is literally an institution that's been in place since 1919, that literally used to operate out of the offices of Lord Rothschild there in London, and was connected with the Rothschilds until 2004. It convened every single day to set the price of gold, and it included Barclays, Deutsche Bank, HSBC, Bank of Nova Scotia, and Societe Generale. So this is something that's been under increasing scrutiny since at least November of last year, when the UK Financial Conduct Authority announced they were opening this investigation. And I think this Barclays charge is so far the only charge that I understand has come out of this investigation, but hopefully will not be the only one. And to whatever extent this is smoke and mirrors and throwing people under the bus to try to distract people, at any rate, there is a change going on in the discourse, and there is more of an understanding that's being openly admitted that the gold price is fixed and manipulated on a daily basis. So I think there is a sea change happening, and we're starting to see the indications of that geopolitically, as you just indicated. David Smith, just before we wrap up, I just want to throw in one more story that I thought was pretty interesting and perhaps reflects on the type of world that we're living in. And not for the good, unfortunately. The Telegraph had an article up earlier this week. London hosts world leaders in debate on fairer capitalism, talking about how Prince Charles, former US President Bill Clinton, the Bank of England Governor Mark Carney, and fund managers representing 1/3 of the world's investable income will descend on London on Tuesday, that's yesterday at the time we're recording this, on a mission to solve capitalism's current problems. The event has been convened under the banner, "The Will to Make Capitalism Fairer, the Means to Do It," talking about how they're apparently going to find practical ways to renew the capitalist system, making it an inclusive engine of economic opportunity and shared prosperity. Other attendees included Christine Lagarde and Larry Summers, and of course the entire event was convened by Lady Rothschild herself, Lynn Forrester de Rothschild, CEO of E.L. Rothschild. So don't worry, everyone. Apparently the Rothschilds, Clintons, Prince Charles, Christine Lagarde's, Larry Summers, and others of the world are apparently going to save capitalism. I don't know about you. That sends a chill down my spine, but David L. Smith, any take on what we just saw there happening in London?
Well, I think it is really wonderful. I mean, we have the rogues gallery almost complete of all the people who caused the problems in the first place. I mean, I think you missed out Robert Rubin. I mean, he's the only name notably missing from that. But if you got Larry Summers, President Clinton, who sold out all the life-saving regulations and the Glass-Steagall Act in the U.S. under pressure and advice from Mr. Summers and Mr. Rubin, then you have the start of the whole problem, or at least not the start. The start was really Nixon with the abandoning of the gold standard. But I mean, when it really went off a cliff and made a huge fortune for these same people sitting at the table, I mean, Rubin and Summers are worth tens and hundreds of millions on the back of the favors that they did for other people. You know, so Christine Lagarde, I mean, what can I say? I mean, she's a lawyer. She isn't even apparently numerate. I mean, I know people who work with her. She doesn't understand figures, but yet she's head of the IMF, and she clucks around there, you know, like a preened hen, saying platitudes, meaningless platitudes. You got Carney, who is successfully blew up the Canadian real estate and credit bubble to a point where he knows perfectly well it's now deflating and collapsing. And he got out before the sinking ship sank. And he is now coming out with statements like, you know, we must have nicer capitalism. Well, I think the way to start to solve the problem is to put people like Clinton and Summers and Rubin and all the rest of them on treason charges. Because until such time as these people have the impression that they're going to end up in prison for what they've done, this kind of thing will go on. And they will all come up with all the arguments which defend their own personal interests and say, you know, if I were Rubin, a senior guy from Citibank, I would say, well, you know, you really have to stop knocking bankers. You know, you and I may say, well, you know, you might want to stop knocking, you know, people who are doing independent broadcasts. I mean, everyone wants to protect their own corner of the yard, and these people have got a very big corner of a very big yard, and the trouble is, it's not that they've ever done anything good, it's just they've done terrible things to the world's economy, the world's population in general, and the beneficiaries are themselves. So, I mean, I would not bother to attend a conference like that, because I would just, I know exactly what they're going to say before they even say it. It's just regurgitating the same speeches for years, and, oh yes, we have to find something fairer, better, nicer, and more lovable. And, you know, off they go. So, I mean, that's my opinion.
Well, I certainly hope it is just hot air, but unfortunately they also like to use these little conferences to further their agendas by, of course, under the name of fairer capitalism and making things nicer for the average person, because these billionaires really care about the average person, don't they? Yeah. All right, well, there you go. I'm not sure we've covered everything of importance, but we've certainly covered a wide swath of material. So once again, why don't you just introduce your website and what you do to the people out there who are listening?
Yeah, my website is the Geneva Business Insider.blogspot.com. I run a financial advisory company. I'm not an investment advisor, but a financial advisor. If you find anything I've said that's interesting or you would like to talk about it, then don't hesitate to send a mail or contact me otherwise. Okay, thank you very much.
Excellent. All right, thank you very much for your time. Looking forward to talking to you again next month.
Pleasure as always. Okay. I don't want to be overworked.